Among all the most powerful divisions of the Waffen SS, the Das Reich was the most decorated, reaching 69 Knight Crosses. They are followed by Leibstandarte with 58 and Viking with 55. Although in this channel we have already analyzed other divisions with the Grobdeutland, the 12th SS Hitlerjugend Division, or the Leibstandarte itself, today it is the turn of another of the most powerful, feared and decorated divisions of the Second World War. This combat unit that we are going to see participated in practically all the great operations of the war, including the Battle of France, Operation Barbarossa, Manstein's counteroffensive in Kharkov, the Battle of Kursk, Normandy, Ardennes, Budapest, Balaton, and finally Vienna. So then, join us through the entire combat history of this division. The origin of this division can be found when, after the Polish campaign, it was decided to unite 3 independent regiments of the Waffen SS and form a division with them. These regiments were the Germania, the Der Führer and the Deutschland. Because these units had participated in the Polish campaign, the newly formed German division had experienced soldiers from the start. Under the command of Paul Hauser himself, this unit, which at that time was not yet called Das Reich, participated in the Battle of France on May 10, 1940. Accompanying the Leibstandarte regiment, this formation advanced throughout Holland, reaching Rotterdam on the 12th. Later he remained in Holland with the task of reducing Allied resistance nuclei that had remained in the Zeeland region. Having completed their task here, on May 24 they went to support the encirclement that the Germans had established at Dunkirk. There they engaged in heavy fighting in an attempt to prevent the Allied rescue, but were unable to penetrate the Allied defenses until most of their enemies had escaped. Once the fighting around Dunkirk was over, the germ of the unit that would soon be known as Das Reich continued to press towards Paris, and would continue until it reached the Pyrenees. After the capitulation of France at the end of June 1940, the unit underwent some modification, such as the replacement of its Germania regiment with a new one. This Germania regiment was the base on which the 5th Division of the Waffen SS, known as the Viking Division, was to be created. In any case, the unit remained in France to participate in Operation Sea Lion against Great Britain, which, as you know, did not take place in the end. Due to this cancellation, she was transferred to Romania, and during the spring of 1941 she participated in the Yugoslavia campaign. It was precisely during this operation that one of the first great successes of this division took place, which was carried out by one of its officers named Fritz Klingenberg. His feat was to take Belgrade with only 6 men, in one of the most brilliant actions of deception in military history. Das Reich then prepared to participate in Operation Barbarossa, specifically within Army Group Center. It would be on Soviet soil where Das Reich would have its toughest and bloodiest battles, suffering a high number of casualties. After fighting numerous battles around the city of Yelnya and Smolensk, the depleted division continued on to Moscow. There it was left completely in pieces after the Soviet counteroffensive of December 1941, and had to be sent urgently to France to put it back together. In February 1942, when it was withdrawn, it was estimated that they had lost more than 60% of their original strength, which made a total of about 10,700 soldiers. While it was reorganizing in France, now constituting itself as a Panzergrenadier division, Das Reich participated in the occupation of Vichy, France in November 1942 and later went on to guard the important port of Toulon. By 1943, already recovered, the Das Reich was sent on a totally urgent basis together with its sister divisions to the Eastern Front, to try to stabilize the situation after the German disaster in Stalingrad, and the unstoppable Soviet advance along the entire German southern flank. Das Reich was one of the first units of the newly created 2nd SS Panzer Corps to arrive in the vicinity of Kharkov and Belgorod to stop the Red Army. With no time to acclimatize, Das Reich quickly entered combat and found herself overwhelmed by Soviet might. Little by little this division also begins to recede and is about to be annihilated in Kharkov. Later on February 20, 1943, the Das Reich joined the counterattack that Manstein carried out in the area and remained on the offensive for a month, along with other units of the German army. Once these operations were over, and before the arrival of the rains, the thaw, and the mud, the Eastern Front had a few months of calm, in which both adversaries took the opportunity to reinforce themselves. On this occasion, Das Reich prepared to attack the Kursk salient from the south, being used as a spearhead along with Leibstandarte and Totenkampf. In this summer of 1943, Das Reich had about 20,000 troops and about 223 armored vehicles of all kinds, including 14 Tigers and dozens of Stug tank destroyers. This made it one of the most powerful divisions of the Third Reich. At this time, the commander-in-chief of the division was the famous General Walter Kruger. The German offensive in Kursk began on July 5, and despite the fact that during the first days they achieved a good rate of advance, little by little they lost their pace until they came to a standstill. The moment of greatest intensity in the southern pincer was the one that occurred between the days of July 10 and 15 in Prokhorovka. There Das Reich had one of its fiercest battles against the Soviet 5th Guards Tank Army. In this battle, the 2nd SS Panzer Corps finally prevailed over the Red Army, causing terrible casualties. However, and despite everything, the advance of the Germans in the Kursk salient was completely paralyzed. On July 12, the Soviets began to attack the Orel salient in the north, and by the 17th they did so in the Donets Basin. This forced the Germans to withdraw troops that had participated in the offensive on Kursk, and now send them to protect their flanks. It was from here that Das Reich began to fight a series of defensive battles along the entire German southern flank of the Eastern Front. After months of hard fighting without rest, the Das Reich was completely exhausted and depleted, so it had to be sent back to France to rebuild. This time it would be designated as the S-Panzer-Division instead of the Panzer Grenadier. The chosen French city was Montauban, in the south of France. Their Das Reich could re-equip and train while at the same time protecting the site from a possible Allied landing. Whether this landing on the Atlantic or Mediterranean crust, the division was prepared to go at any time to the threatened area. By this date, the unit was no longer composed of those experienced soldiers of yesteryear, since most of its troops were inexperienced recruits with very little training time. Due to the criticality of the situation, this feature only increased. Regarding its armor, Das Reich had 37 Panzer IVs, 55 Panthers and 30 Stug 3s. One day after the landing in Normandy, the Das Reich received the order to go there at full speed. The road distance between them and Normandy was about 700 kilometers. It was here that one of the most famous episodes of this division took place. Its origin was in the sabotage carried out by the British Special Operations Directorate on the railways that were to transport the division to the Normandy beaches. This organization was in charge of all kinds of sabotage actions in territory occupied by the Germans, with the support of the civilian population and the different local resistance groups. Once they managed to sabotage the German transport trains, the Das Reich division had no choice but to cross all of France by road. This was going to greatly delay their arrival in Normandy, in addition to exhausting and wearing out the men and vehicles. In addition to the wear suffered by the terrain, the Das Reich was receiving attacks from the French resistance, which was making traps and ambushes along the way. This caused Das Reich to carry out anti-partisan actions that basically consist of massacring civilians as a reprimand. It is estimated that approximately 1,000 civilians were executed by Das Reich on their way through France, while on their way to Normandy. The division also suffered numerous air attacks and was finally reaching the fighting zone in Normandy by drops from June 15. Although it was intended that they make a strong offensive that would send the Allies back to the sea, when it arrived it did not have the power to do so. It is estimated that it was not until July 10 when all the elements of the division arrived in Normandy, so they could not do anything but defend the places critical to the front. Das Reich was fighting in the western sector of Normandy, right where the Americans finally broke through at the end of July with Operation Cobra. After the loss of France, the division had to be sent back to Germany in October 1944 to recover. There he prepared for the new offensive in which he was to participate, this being the one carried out by the Ardennes in December of that same year. Again, they did not obtain any significant achievement, and after a few days of combat in which they managed to surprise their enemies, everything turned against them again when the Allies began to mobilize and made use of their great numerical superiority. After this action, they were sent at full speed to Hungary, where the Soviets had made important advances. There they would again participate in one of the last German offensives of the Second World War, this being the one at Lake Balaton, which we recently analyzed on the channel. Finally, and after being rejected here as well, Das Reich continued fighting in its retreat towards Vienna. Another small group of the division would end his days in Prague, where he helped to evacuate civilians so that they did not fall into the hands of the Soviets. Finally, the men of Das Reich surrendered to the Americans near the city of Linz, although there were other smaller groups that did so in other places. Without a doubt, the history of this division is much broader and more complex, both in terms of its origin and its end, but in this episode we wanted to tell it in a condensed and summarized way so that everyone is clear about what the actions of combat that this division had. We hope in the future to be able to do a broader program about it, as we did with the Leibstadtarte. I leave you in the description programs in which we analyze battles in which this division participated, such as Prokhorovka, Manstein's counterattack in Kharkov, or the Lake Balaton offensive. We say goodbye here. Many thanks to everyone, especially the sponsors who make this possible. Subscribe and share this program if you liked it, and see you in the next one. See you soon.